You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Insel.
All right, everybody, welcome to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I have a new guest on the show today, John Dangelo. He's been publishing some articles and blog posts both at the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com. Great stuff on a pretty wide variety of topics. We were talking about internet censorship, coronavirus, all the way to Middle East foreign policy. His big website is Anti-War War Vet, and that is because he is a war vet, and he is also an ER nurse, and he's done, various blogging and writing for Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com, which is, of course, the two places that I also work in this libertarian world, and you can find my work in this podcast at those sites as well. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Kyle.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to have you on. I've been thinking about doing it for a while, and with this whole having a lot of time off work, I was like, well, I schedule just about anything right now, so I figured I'd schedule you on for a show. And you've been doing some real good work in this one at the Libertarian Institute, which is on the Earn It, which is a new bill, and we'll get into all that. But the headline of the article is Turning the Handle on the Door They Can't Breach. So why don't you go ahead and I guess just start off kind of generally let us know what is going on with the Earn It Act and why you felt the need that, it's so important we got to write an article about it.
Sure. Yeah. So I had seen some news headlines about it and started reading, and I'm actually not in any way an expert in anything really technological, but it really caught my eye based on the timing. I was doing a piece on the coronavirus, and it had caught my eye that they were trying to sort of pass this bill through or, see it on the House floor, the Senate floor. And so I started doing some research, and the Earn It bill is a new legislative effort to carve out Section 230, which we can talk about a little bit. And what it claims to do is require website owners who have any user content creation whatsoever, whether that be like a comment section on antiwar.com all the way to Facebook's feeds, that they would have to earn immunity under Section 230, which before was a previously court-upheld protection for those same owners when it came to liability. So, for example, if on Facebook people make claims that they want to incite violence or they want to, in this case, traffic children for sex, Facebook would not be liable for what those users were doing. Obviously, the users would be. And Section 230 is what offers that legal protection for them. So Earn It is drafted, at least ostensibly, that's what the claims are, that they're going to protect for child sex trafficking because that's been the subject of the bill. But in it, they're going to require all website users or website owners rather to show that they are compliant with a checklist that they've yet to develop. And Lindsey Graham, who's one of the co-sponsors of the bill, has made it clear that encryption will be part of that, even though Blumenthal, another co-sponsor, and several other lawmakers involved keep saying that encryption's not involved at all. And look, we didn't even put the word encryption in. That's how you know that encryption's not part of the bill. But what the law will do is set an undeveloped checklist as the precedent, and then they'll develop the checklist afterwards, which I think is terrifying.
Right. And I just wanted to ask real quick, and I know that, the intent of the bill is very rarely the reality. Well, the public one that they say is very rarely, what's actually going on behind the scenes. But in this case, if you ask Lindsey Graham right now, like, why do we need to pass this thing? What excuse is he making, or what, are they pushing? It's just the human trafficking and sex trafficking. That's their little clip. Like, this is just about protecting people, that are at risk.
Right. I mean, throughout this article, I probably should have spent a little more time making it clear. I mean, child sex trafficking is an issue, and it's fairly rampant worldwide. I mean, I was doing a bunch of research just for this piece about different studies that have been done. I mean, obviously, it's really hard to quantify, but a recent study in Canada and a bunch of data from the State Department shows that, I mean, there are tens of thousands of kids that are subject to this or are still in it. And it's anything from sex work, child sex work, to child pornography. And the vast majority of these kids are coming from either the welfare system, the child welfare system in Canada, which is like their foster system, or our foster system. It's brutal. And so the bill is in an effort to curb sex trafficking, which, you know, like you said, they're often not related to the topic at hand. This is such an extraneous bill for child sex trafficking when there's huge gaps that they should be addressing. And all the literature on this stuff is talking about how to address those gaps, none of which is taking away end-to-end encryption for Facebook users.
Right. So, you know, and I think it makes it, you know, the way they'll portray it is, oh my God, you know, how could you possibly stand against anything that's going to, you know, prevent child sex trafficking? And, you know, the bill probably won't be as effective or effective at all. It may even take steps in the wrong direction a lot of times with government regulation. But the reality is, you know, you actually have Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal, you know, standing on these children and using them rather than actually trying to help them, just to, you know, have power grabs and you know, and we'll talk about backdoor. So I did want you to, I was going to ask you about specifically about Section 230. Did you have more to say on that, or did you kind of think you explained all as much as we need to know for today?
Yeah, no, Section 230 is really important. So it's the Communications Decency Act was passed in 96, and Section 230 has stood to be sort of the legal precedent for protecting website owners from liability for what their users post. And it's been through the courts a few times. And in 2018, Trump passed a law called FOSTA, which contributed to the first major legal carve out, again, related to sex trafficking. And so Section 230 is kind of amongst all of the tech commentators and experts that talk about this stuff and the people in the industry interested. They all understand Section 230 is a singular pillar in internet privacy for individuals, because if you were to remove Section 230, you would put the onus on website owners like Facebook, and I'll just use Facebook and Zuckerberg as the example because it's easiest. It would make Mark Zuckerberg and his company personally liable or professionally liable for anything that their users posted, which is an untenable situation for these companies. I mean, some of them have billions of posts a day. There's no way that they could potentially censor or monitor that effectively. And so what would come about from that is a much different looking platform for all these big companies, where they would have to remove or really tailor private messaging and anything that would use encryption so that they could either view those messages or outright remove them. In the article, I talk about how when FOSTA was passed, Craigslist didn't really know how it was going to look. And that's the other problem, is the companies don't know how it's going to look in the courts once the laws are passed. So to get ahead of it and to remove any potential liability from themselves, Craigslist went and removed their personal ads altogether, because there was an understanding that sex workers were using things like the Craigslist ad page and back page to set up with clients. And what that ended up seeing, as I mentioned in the article, is San Francisco was used as a case study. A bunch of San Francisco sex workers were forced from the comfort of their own homes, setting up their own businesses, to having to go back to the streets where it's extremely dangerous. And there was a huge uptick in sex worker violence because of it. I mean, you add those sorts of unintended consequences that the government never learns from to something like end-to-end encryption, and I think the landscape's a lot scarier.
Right. That is one thing to really stop and point out here, is that a bill similar to this one that got passed, you know, in the past, the actual effect wasn't helping sex workers, but put them back on the streets in more dangerous situations. This is a story that Reason has covered really well. and I've seen Thaddeus Russell do a couple talks with Megan McNeil on, kind of this phenomenon of the government claiming to be helping sex workers, but in all these cases, it actually just puts them in more dangerous situations. So, the bill, again, you have a section in here, I think, called it stands or uses children as human shields. So do you want to talk about that a little bit and just how, that's Lindsey Graham doing it again, invoking, the victim children. I guess at least this time the victims probably exist a little bit more than some of his other fabrications to grab more power for the U.S. federal government.
Right. I think that's what's so odious about this is that there is actual victims. I referenced it in the piece, but I kept thinking about the baby and incubator story from Kuwait and that whole hoax that spurned a population into supporting the war in Iraq. And obviously that was a hoax and sex trafficking isn't. And so when Lindsey Graham gets up there and starts preaching to everybody about how important stopping sex trafficking is, legislators who are having to go back to their constituencies and the general public are all convinced. I mean, that's an emotional argument that is hard to argue against. And the passage of FOSTA saw a woman get in front of the Senate and give this really difficult to listen to speech about what happened to her daughter, which was brutal. She was a victim of sex trafficking and ended up being murdered. And that was seen to be sort of the testimony that drove it to passage. Beforehand, nobody in the tech industry really expected it to pass because it had so much resistance. But my point in saying that children are being used as human shields here is that obviously it's a terrible thing, but it's very cynically done. I mean, they're passing it amidst this huge coronavirus outbreak, and then on top of that, putting this barrier of children and that emotional piece of it. And it is an issue that the State Department has dealt with and that, independent NGOs and stuff have been dealing with worldwide for a long time. And so instead of actually passing meaningful legislation to try to combat some of these gaps in the foster systems at state levels or standardizing the way that kids are, being adopted or being cared for, they pass this, which is targeting tech in a way that is going to have very little impact on the way that child sex trafficking is actually functioning. I mean, to think that Facebook messaging or some of these encrypted websites are where they are the only place that they can communicate is just ridiculous. And I think it makes it very clear that that's not the aim of the bill overall, to combat sex trafficking, but instead to get that end-to-end encryption backdoor that they've been fighting for so long. As more people go online and communicate in encrypted ways, the federal government and their spy apparatus does not want to have all of that information in the dark. They want to be able to see what we're saying privately, and that's something that we have to resist.
So just something to go back to, you've used Facebook as an example here, but this would apply to everyone, right? So like if I ran a website and people are just able to comment on the articles I wrote, would I be responsible for that content? If somebody like got on one of my articles and was like, does anybody want to buy $100 of weed? And somebody agrees, and then that transaction happened on my website. Could I then have like some federal liability here? Are we talking about to that extent, or is it more you have to, I guess, approve a post like on Facebook or something like the WordPress post that I put up itself would be the thing that the content is regulated?
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So, I mean, the food blog you get tonight's dinner recipe off of, if they have a comment section, they would be liable to earning Section 230 immunity. And that's another really drastic legislative change here because the Section 230 immunities are understood to be across the board for all internet services. They have it already. It's a First Amendment right per the courts. And so now earn it would mean that if you want to maintain your Section 230 immunity, you have to have this compliance checklist gone through and show that, you have to be able to demonstrate that you're abiding by it. And this checklist will be created by a new 19-member committee, including Treasury, Homeland Security, and the Attorney General. And they'll go through and make sure that whatever items on the list will help to, again, quote unquote, combat child sex trafficking. Lindsey Graham had a question about how this will affect encryption, though, and unlike all the other people that are involved in the bill, he made mention of Facebook specifically to say that, well, Facebook is blind, and we can't go in blind when asked whether or not they were going to include encryption on the checklist. So again, I think it's important to understand the checklist has not been made and will not be made until the law is passed and the committee is stood up. So we don't know what will be on that checklist, and that checklist will still be an extension of this law, which, having post hoc additions to a law that could include something like end-to-end encryption is not something that anybody in the public should be supportive of, whether or not they want to combat sex trafficking.
I'm not sure if this is something that but what was the response of tech companies like Facebook been here? Because I could see one situation, where they're very opposed to this, and I know this did happen in the past with like SOPA and some other internet ads where like companies and grad students all came out and said hell no to it. But this seems like another case where they're going to create a bureaucracy, and then Facebook feels like, they could buy enough people and influence within that board that they could make sure that, let's say, Minds or MeWe or, BitChute over YouTube or whatever kind of alternative social media site you won't consent to whatever kind of regulations they put on that list. So maybe that they would be in support of this to kind of establish their monopoly here.
Yeah. I was reading about support for it, and I don't really remember the specific companies. I know that, like FOSTA, there's sort of a general feeling among tech that this is not something that would be good for the industry. I don't know where Facebook and the big players stand on it, only because just what you said, oftentimes they are able to manipulate with support how these bills end up affecting them personally. And frankly, Facebook doesn't rely a lot on encryption as some of these other sites do, and they may be fine with either eliminating Facebook messaging or tailoring it to work with the feds. I don't know. So I can't answer that question super accurately, but I do know that, like FOSTA, there's a sort of general consensus that this would not be good. And this would sort of open the door to creating the back door that you mentioned that they're looking for in end-to-end encryption.
All right. Well, do you have any other concerns laid out from this bill? If not, I can move on to the next article I got for you.
Well, the only thing that I would say is, just like the implications of this bill, and there's another bill in front of the House right now, HR 5715. It was recently introduced amidst this whole coronavirus panic, and that focuses on sweeping gun control measures. And I just think it's really telling that the government would use a public in crisis like we are right now to try to pass the major legislative moves that would drastically alter the way that we live our lives or interface with our websites or the way that we can own or purchase firearms. These are fundamental rights that we enjoy and that shouldn't be subject to the government either way. And now we're seeing that when everybody else is in a worry about whether or not they're social distancing enough, the feds managed to retire to Capitol Hill to draft these ridiculous pieces of legislation. And so, I think they're using their training from Rahm Emanuel well, that we never let a good crisis go to waste or a serious crisis go to waste. And it's really a shame. I hope that there's more people standing up and making some noise about this, and we don't see the back door that they're looking for, the master key, like Tim Cook referred to it as.
Right. Well, maybe not that there are many great things about or any really great things about the coronavirus, but chasing all the politicians out of DC would have been one of them. But it looks like they're just going to exploit that the best they could to shove through this while everybody's on all out. I mean, just kind of looking and seeing how people are reacting on social media when I have gone out to the store, seeing how just people are acting. The line at the grocery store yesterday was great. The line was really long because everybody was saying like, a cart plus like probably 4 or 5 feet apart. So, it was just a crazy situation to be at a store and see that. I don't think I've ever been at a store that wasn't like, in its final week of closing that was so empty. and possibly in my entire life. You know what I mean? It was just like a situation that I've never witnessed before. And so now the corona, at least the hysteria has hit here, and how serious the virus is, and whether it's between somewhere the Black Plague and swine flu or whatever. Maybe we could talk a little bit about here. But at least, I guess, when I think of this, I am in the U.S. and I'm located in an area with like several worldwide top hospitals, within a few miles of me. So, in a sense, I don't feel too concerned, about my like personal health through all of this. I mean, I am taking some extra precautions and everything, but at the same time, I am able to imagine situations in U.S. prisons, here in the U.S., but worldwide, Yemen, Gaza, Iraq, Iran, is the current crisis, Venezuela, North Korea. And, you being a war vet and a ER nurse, I figure maybe you would have a unique perspective on how the coronavirus may impact and hit war stricken areas like Syria, Iraq, or Yemen.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is obviously the area that I like to spend the most time reading about. That is foreign policy. And, I did do a piece for the Libertarian Institute about coronavirus. And, I think I have a fairly nuanced view in that I really don't think that a lot of the conspiratorial wing of the libertarian or liberty movement folks are on point. I think that this is a legitimate threat. I think it's legitimately concerning. There's still a lot that we don't know about it, which is one of the reasons that we should be concerned, is because if it's very transmissible and it doesn't have seasonability, meaning that it goes away during warmer times, we could be seeing months and months of ebbs and flows in this outbreak. And people are absolutely right that the mortality rate is low, but on a big enough scale, those numbers are still significant. And when they get into areas like nursing homes, or just like you said, prisons, sparsely or densely populated areas that you can't do anything about, and you can't legislate or by government decree make them disperse, we're going to see that ravage those communities. And anybody who has any compromise to their immune system or has a more severe reaction to it is at risk. And I think that that's not something to downplay. However, I live in Connecticut, and we've seen quite a bit of government involvement in how we go about our daily lives, mandating that businesses are closing and strongly recommending that we remain home and all of this stuff. I do think that there's a legitimate concern about how the government responds to this, what kind of laws are passed in response to this that don't go away after the outbreak is controlled. For places like the third world that we've been bombing for 20 years, they have a really hard time because first, I mean, each country has sort of a different dynamic, but all of them share the commonality that they don't really have advanced medical systems to begin with. Something like fully trained medical doctors coming out of postgraduate programs and hitting a residency is fairly uncommon in all of these places, or completely unheard of. I mean, Iran is the most successful. Iraq used to be. But these wars in varying ways have really negatively impacted their ability to respond to this stuff. And whether it's sanctions that are making it difficult for materials directly related to medical care are making it to them, or if it's stuff that relates to medical education or medical infrastructure, sanctions have had a huge impact on how these countries have had to deal with the virus or have to deal with medicine in general. So, we just in February of this year, reimposed sanctions on Yemen, and they're continuing to have reports from independent facilities or independent NGOs saying that their medical system is on the brink of collapse. They don't have any of the necessary equipment to render even basic care to people. And they've had several, the Physicians for Human Rights says that they've been able to verify at least 120 attacks on medical personnel or medical facilities. And that's killed almost 1,000 people in just the numbers that they're able to get together. And there's been reports that the ground invasion there has seen medical facilities being occupied by Syrians, or Saudis rather, and forcing patients out so that they can be treated or they can use it for tactical purposes. So with the constant flow of trauma that's going to happen anytime there's a war going on, plus normal disease, plus all of these sanctions, it's an absolute disaster for these people. And, basic things like having chest pain, like you said, I work in an ER. Somebody coming in for chest pain is a legitimate medical emergency that requires quite a bit of diagnostics and interventions to rule in or rule out various issues and then treat them. I mean, those things are not happening in Yemen. Point blank, those people are having terrible outcomes relative to what should be expected where medicine is in the first world or in the West. In Syria, the climate's a little bit different because the Syrian government themselves have actually been responsible for targeting a lot of the medical facilities that are in ISIS-controlled territories. So the Assad government and the Russian government have been responsible for targeting military infrastructure in anywhere that's been at all involved with ISIS occupation, which is, again, it just goes to show that these wars, they're, because of all the technology involved in actually fighting wars, it's changed from the clean cut ideas of red versus blue fighting it out in the trenches or whatever. We're targeting civilians explicitly. And I say we as in both the U.S. government and just the military uses these sorts of tactics all the time. And the medical infrastructure systems in these countries, being fragile already, are perfect targets. I was actually just doing some reading in Iraq this morning. Their Baghdad College of Medicine, which in the 80s was premier relative to their regional standards, has basically completely stagnated because they don't have the personnel to staff. They don't have the ability to get students through postgraduate with success. So they have a really high quit rate. They don't have the materials they need. They don't have the new knowledge coming in from the West about how to structure with new medical technologies and advances, how to structure learning. And they're really stuck in the 1980s, which is a shame because that's a country that dire need, everywhere with Corona, but generally with the war that's been going on there since the 80s, various wars that have been going on there since the 80s. It's really terrible that none of these people are getting the basic care that they need, and none of the professionals that should be able to render it are coming out equipped to do so.
Yeah. And it doesn't seem to be something the Trump administration is really considering at all, lifting sanctions on Iran. They seem content to increase sanctions, that they're looking at this as an opportunity to get their maximum pressure campaign that definitely I don't imagine it'll work now because of this coronavirus, but would never worked before anyways. With the additional pressure of the coronavirus, I don't know, maybe something really crazy could happen in Iran. But I guess at the point that we are now, they just seem content with continuing these war, continuing the bombing. We're still fighting in Afghanistan. It looks like we're not going to be moving any troops in or out of anywhere for the next few months because of the coronavirus. So status quo and, possible, I guess, just absolute train wrecks and nightmares coming to various places where the U.S. has been fighting wars over the past 20 years. John, do you got anything else to add?
Yeah, the only thing I would want to leave your listeners with, who probably are well acquainted with this stuff anyway, but for anybody who maybe isn't super sympathetic to the anti-war view, just think about how your neighbors or maybe yourself are relating to the coronavirus outbreak and all the panic that's been going on and all the fear that's, even though it's legitimate, is really pervasive and is, I think, struck every single American in one way or another. These countries that we're at war with or that we're heavily sanctioning, we can't begin to imagine what they're going with this panic going on top of not having basic medical supplies like IV saline, which is fundamental to almost any medical management case. Whatever fear we're having now, it's tenfold or more in all of these countries. And countries like Iran or Yemen, these are countries that have had really devastating effects from the sanctions that we've already done. And for our governments to be so cynical as to continue with these maximum pressure campaigns in the hopes that the civilian population will, I don't know if they are hoping that they'll rise up against the governments there or what, but this is a really brutal way to capitalize on that fear. And it's something that we should all be able to really relate to now, whereas generally I think Americans are pretty unaware of what's going on outside the world. I mean, just imagine if you had the coronavirus and you also couldn't get basic medical care on top of it, and that was your daily life and what you had for expectations when you went to the medical facilities that you are supposed to trust, is that maybe they'll be made ruins on top of your head. I think that's something that should maybe at least illuminate how awful these wars are and how dire it is that we put a stop to them.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show today, John. Tell people about your anti-war war vet website and the work you do at Anti-War and Libertarian Institute.
Yeah, so I've got 2 young kids and a full-time job. So I do this stuff in my off time. I've been pretty productive. I just had my second child. I was telling you before we got on the phone. So I was able to write quite a bit, but I do post anything I write on my blog, antiwarwarvet.com, and I post fairly regularly, well, every day on my Instagram, and fairly regularly when I can elsewhere on social media. I'd love to have people follow me and check me out. I'm trying to just to really centralize on veterans who should be anti-war and aren't, but I've kind of gotten away from that, ended up writing on coronavirus and stuff like that. But that's the ultimate thrust of my site and my hopes, is to make more anti-war war vets, and hopefully people can get a little something out of checking out the blog.
All right, well, it's a good cause, and everybody check it out, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Kyle.